Hey guys, tonight we are spending some time with the missing who are finally found, not found alive, and I want to be honest about that from the very first minute, because these are hard stories and they deserve honesty, but found and named and brought home. Tonight we are going to sit with more than a dozen people who walked out into the wide, quiet places of this country and did not come back. People who became a skull along a river, a child in the desert, a young woman in a cornfield, a nameless figure on the side of a road. For years, in some cases for more than half a century, no one knew who they were. And then, one by one, the land gave them back, and science gave them their names. And somewhere, a family that had spent decades staring at an empty chair finally got to say the word that had been missing from every conversation. Her name, his name, the people they had always been. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt. And thank you, truly, for all of the case suggestions. So many of tonight's stories came from you. We are also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would rather close your eyes and just listen there tonight. Now dim the lights and get comfortable. This is a long one, and every person in it waited a long time to be heard, so we are going to take our time. Think of tonight less as a catalogue of tragedies and more as a series of homecomings, delayed by decades, but real. Each of these people was somebody's child. Each of them had a favorite song and a way of laughing and a seat at a table that was never filled again. We are going to remember them as people first, and only then as cases. Have you ever wondered how someone can simply vanish into the open country and stay lost for 40 years in an age of records and searches and satellites? Have you ever wondered what it does to a family to wait that long, to grow old inside a question that has no answer? And have you ever wondered what finally changes, what small and quiet thing arrives that lets a river or a desert or a field give up a secret it has kept since before some of us were born? To understand all of that, we need to go north first, farther north than almost anyone lives, to a cold and winding river near the top of the world, because this is where our first story begins, and in a way, it is the story that made all the others possible. Picture the Porcupine River. It runs for hundreds of miles through the northeastern corner of Alaska and across the border into Canada, threading through a country so empty that you can fly over it for an hour and see no road, no house, no light. This is not wilderness the way a national park is wilderness, groomed and mapped and dotted with rangers. This is the real thing. The kind of vast, indifferent land that does not care whether you live or die, that will freeze you in the winter and drown you in the spring melt and hide you forever if it chooses to. People still go there. They go to hunt, to trap, to test themselves against something bigger than a city. And in the late summer of 1976, a young man from upstate New York went there too, and the river kept him for 46 years. His name was Gary Frank Southerden. He was about 25 years old, the youngest of 4 children, and by every account, he was the kind of person the word restless was invented for. He grew up in Clay, New York, a quiet town a dozen miles or so northwest of Syracuse, the youngest sibling to Jean, to Stephen, and to Anne. His brother Stephen would later describe him with a phrase that comes up again and again when people talk about Gary: a free spirit. After high school, He did not settle into the expected life. He traveled, he crossed the country and went up into Canada. And for a while, he rode the railroad cars the way an earlier generation of wanderers had, chasing the horizon just to see what was past it. He was looking for something, or maybe he was just built for motion, the way some people are. And then he found Alaska. He arrived in the early 1970s, drawn like a lot of young men of that era to the great project that was reshaping the state, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. He worked on it for a few years, hard work in a hard place, and it suited him. Alaska was the biggest thing he had ever pushed himself against, and he loved it. To understand what happened to Gary, you have to understand that he was not lost the way a tourist gets lost. He was a capable outdoorsman who had chosen this life on purpose, who knew the risks and wanted them anyway, which is part of what makes the ending so quiet and so cruel. The land did not trick him. It simply won. You are standing on the bank of the Porcupine River in the last warm days of summer, 1976. The light up here at this time of year is strange and long, the sun sliding around the sky instead of setting, so that afternoon bleeds into a gold that lasts for hours. The water is cold and fast and the color of weak tea. There's a smell of spruce and wet earth and something colder underneath it. The first breath of the winter that is already on its way. Gary and a friend have flown in, dropped by a small plane onto this remote stretch north of the Arctic Circle, and the plan is simple and old as the hills. The two of them will walk down opposite sides of the river, hunting and trapping as they go, and they will reunite downstream when the cold sets in and the river freezes hard enough to cross. It is the kind of plan that has worked 1,000 times. It is the kind of plan that only has to fail once. The friend made it out. Gary did not. Somewhere along that river, in a place no one witnessed and no one can name, Gary Southerton's life ended. The last time his brother Stephen spoke to him was the day before he flew out, an ordinary phone call. The kind you do not know is the last one until years later, when you are turning it over in your mind, trying to remember every word. And then there was only silence, and the silence stretched into weeks, and the weeks became the awful arithmetic that every family of a missing person learns to do. He would have called by now. He would have surfaced somewhere, and something was clearly and terribly wrong. His parents, Donald and Lucille, did not simply wait. In 1977, the year after he vanished, they paid a mountain guide to go into that country and look for their son. The guide canoed down the Porcupine River, mile after mile of cold water and empty bank, and he found something. He found Gary's broken glasses. He found his identification. Small, personal, unmistakable things. The kind of objects that place a specific human being at a specific bend in a river and then say nothing more about where he went. There were aerial searches too, planes flying low over the winding water. But the country is enormous, and a single person in it is smaller than a thought. Nothing else was found, no body and no answer, only the glasses and the papers and the silence. So the family did what families do when the world refuses to give them a grave. They built one anyway. In the family cemetery plot back in Clay, New York, beside where Donald and Lucille would one day rest, the Southertons placed a stone for their son, and on it they had words carved that are, when you sit with them, almost unbearably tender. Lost in Alaska. That was the fact of it, stated as plainly as a fact can be. Lost in Alaska in the 1970s. A stone over an empty space, marking a grief with no body to bury. They assumed, in the way you assume things you cannot bear to leave uncertain, that Gary had died of the cold. There had been bad weather in the area around the time he vanished, and hypothermia is a quiet killer in that country, a thing that takes strong and capable people who make one small mistake in the wrong hour. It was, in its way, a merciful theory, because it was quick and it did not involve fear. For decades, that was the story the family carried, the shape they gave to the empty space. Gary went to Alaska, the place he loved, and the cold took him, and that was that. Except it was not that. And the true ending, when it finally came, would arrive from a direction no one in 1976 could have imagined, because more than 20 years later, on a summer day in 1997, another man was out along the Porcupine River, a hunter this time, moving through that same empty country, and he found a human skull. He reported it, as you would, and Alaska state troopers out of Fairbanks flew to the scene. They searched the area around where the skull lay, roughly 8 miles from the Canadian border, that same lonely stretch of river. They found no other remains, just the skull, alone, weathered by 20 years of Alaskan seasons. They collected it carefully and sent it to the state medical examiner's office, where it was logged as what it was, unidentified human remains. Someone's son, someone's brother, and no way in the world to say whose. The medical examiner did learn one thing, and it is a hard thing, so I will state it once and not linger. Based on the shape and size and placement of the marks on the bone, the likely cause of death was a bear. It is a death that is difficult to think about, and I am not going to describe it, because Gary was a person and not a horror story, and because his family has to live with the knowledge and does not need it embellished by strangers. What matters for the story is this. Here was a skull, on a shelf, in an evidence room, carrying within it the answer to a mystery that a family in New York had been carrying for 20 years, and for 25 more years, the two halves of that answer sat in different rooms of the country, unable to find each other. The family had a name and no body. The state had a body and no name. And there was no bridge between them. Have you ever thought about how many stories in this country are stuck exactly there? A name with no body. A body with no name. The distance between them measured not in miles but in the limits of what science could do. For most of the 20th century, that distance was uncrossable. A skull could tell you it was human, could tell you an approximate age, could sometimes tell you how a person died. It could not tell you their name. It could not reach across 2 decades and a continent and connect to a broken pair of glasses in an evidence box in Fairbanks and a headstone in clay that said, "Lost in Alaska." The technology to do that did not exist until, quietly, it did. Now picture an ordinary evening in the early 2000s or the 2010s in some suburb anywhere in America. A person you will never meet sits down at their computer, spits into a small plastic tube, and mails it off to a company because they are curious about their ancestry. Where did my family come from? Who am I related to? It is a hobby, a bit of fun, a gift someone got for the holidays. That person has no idea, none at all, that the sample they just mailed will one day help a team of investigators put a name to a skull found along a river near the top of the world. But that is exactly what happened, because millions of ordinary people built their family trees in public and private databases they created without meaning to, the single most effective tool for finding the missing that the world has ever had. In April of 2022, investigators in Alaska decided to try it. They had watched genetic genealogy solve other cold cases, had seen it name the unnamed and identify killers who thought they had gotten away clean, and they wondered whether it could reach this old, cold, shelved case too. The Alaska Crime Lab extracted DNA from the skull. Then cold case investigators took that genetic profile and did the painstaking work of comparison, searching the family trees that strangers had built, looking for the branch that would lead them home. And they found it. The DNA pointed tentatively to a second cousin of a man named Gary Frank Southerden of New York. You can imagine, maybe, the care with which they made the next call. They found a living relative, and that relative was willing to help, and they explained who Gary had been and how he had gone north to hunt along the Porcupine River in the mid-1970s and was never heard from again. The relative provided a DNA sample, and it confirmed everything. The skull along the Porcupine River was Gary, the free spirit from Clay, the young man who rode the railroad cars and worked the pipeline and loved the biggest country he could find, had been there, at that bend in the river, the whole time. 46 years. His brother Stephen got the call in December of 2022. He told a reporter later that he had been crying a lot since it came. And what he said about it is worth sitting with, because it captures a thing that runs through every single story tonight, a thing about the particular shape of this kind of grief. There had not been closure, he said, because they had always held onto the hope that maybe, somehow, Gary was still alive out there, living some other life, choosing not to call. And now, he said, they realized that was not the case. Read that again slowly. The answer they had waited nearly half a century for was, in the most literal sense, the death of a hope they had been quietly carrying the whole time. That is what closure actually costs. It is not relief arriving. It is a door that had been left open, at last, gently closed. But listen to what else he said, because this is the part that matters, the part that turns this from a story about loss into a story about something better. It is nice, he said, after 45 years, to have some closure. We always wondered what would happen. He thanked the crime lab. He thanked the investigative genetic genealogist, a woman named Patricia Busby, who had helped trace the branches of that family tree back to Gary. Gary's remains were to be cremated and returned to the family, and that headstone in clay, the one that had stood for decades over nothing at all, the one that said lost in Alaska, would finally have him beneath it, beside his parents, Donald and Lucille, in the family plot. The family planned to gather in the spring when the ground softened, to remember his life and lay him to rest at last. It took the river 46 years to give him back, and it gave him back in pieces, and even then it kept most of the details to itself. But it gave him back, and it did so because of a technology that did not exist for almost the entire time he was missing, sitting in a lab, comparing the DNA in a shelved skull against the family trees that millions of ordinary people had quietly built. Hold on to that thought, because we are going to come back to it again and again, all night long. Gary Southerden was not found by a better search. He was found by a stranger's curiosity about their own ancestry, decades later, and by investigators patient enough to follow it home. And if that could reach a skull on a shelf near the Arctic Circle, then think of who else it might reach. Think of all the others, because Gary was not the only one the wild places kept. he was only the first we will talk about. And to find our next person, we are going to travel about as far from that cold northern river as you can get and still be in the same country, down into the burning heat of the Arizona desert and back in time to a summer 16 years before Gary ever flew north, to a little girl who was playing in an alley behind her grandmother's house on an ordinary afternoon, right up until she wasn't. Her name was Sharon Lee Gallegos, and she was 4 years old. She was born on the 6th of September, 1955, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, a small city out in the high desert country in the southern part of the state, the kind of place where the mountains stand blue on the horizon and the heat comes up off the ground in waves you can see. By the accounts that survive, she was a happy child, the sort her family remembered decades later as happy-go-lucky, a little girl who laughed easily. On a summer afternoon in the July of 1960, she was doing the most ordinary thing a 4-year-old can do. She was playing outside in the alley behind her grandmother's house with 2 other children, the way kids did in that neighborhood on any given day, in the long light of a desert evening. You are there in that alley if you let yourself be. It is late July, and the day is finally cooling, the worst of the heat sliding off toward the mountains. The dirt is warm under bare feet. There is the sound of other children, the ordinary background music of a summer that seems like it will last forever. Somewhere, a screen door bangs. Sharon is small, 4 years old, close enough to home that home is the only world she knows. And then a car comes down the alley, a dark green sedan, dirty, an older Plymouth, and there are 2 adults in it, a man and a woman, strangers, and in a matter of seconds, in the time it takes to describe it, they take her, they pull her into the car, and the car speeds off, and the ordinary summer evening tears cleanly in half, into the time before and the time after. Her aunt, a young woman named Beatrice, heard the commotion. She got to a window in time to see the car pulling away with Sharon inside, and her first instinct was the right one, the human one. She wanted to jump in a car and chase them down, but she did not know how to drive, and the family home had no telephone. So she ran for help, ran to find anyone who could do something. By the time help could be raised, the green Plymouth was gone, and with it, Sharon. She had been taken in broad daylight from behind her own grandmother's house with witnesses, and still she was gone, swallowed whole by a summer afternoon. The searches began at once, the family and the local authorities combing Alamogordo and the country around it. But this was 1960. There was no national database, no missing child alert system, no way to push a little girl's face out across the country in an afternoon. The reach of a search was the reach of the people doing it, and a car with a 10-minute head start could be anywhere, could cross a state line before anyone even understood what had happened. Days passed, and the trail, such as it was, went cold in the desert heat. 10 days after Sharon was taken, and more than 300 miles to the west, in the neighboring state of Arizona, a school teacher was out in the desert. He had come with his family from Las Vegas to hunt for interesting rocks, one of those small, harmless pleasures that draw people out into the empty country. He was walking a desolate stretch of ground outside a tiny place called Congress in Yavapai County, about half a mile down a dusty road, when he came upon something that was not a rock. Partially buried in the sandy wash lay the body of a small child. She had been there, the investigators would later estimate, for something like a week or two. And what had been done to her before she was left in that wash was cruel. And I am not going to detail it, because Sharon was a little girl and not a subject for that kind of description, and because the people who loved her have carried the truth of it for a lifetime and are owed our restraint. What I will tell you is the small, specific, heartbreaking things, because those are the things that make her a person and not a case file. She had brown hair. Her little fingernails had been painted red, the way a child paints her nails to feel grown up, and on her feet were a pair of men's rubber flip-flops that had been cut down, trimmed carefully to fit her small feet by someone. There was a pocket knife found nearby. These are the details that stay with you: the red fingernails and the cut-down sandals, the evidence of a child who had been, in some small ways, cared for right up until the end. The authorities in Arizona had almost nothing to go on. And here is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, because it is the part where the answer was there and was missed. Within days of the discovery, someone did raise the question: could this little girl in the Arizona wash be the child who had just been taken from Alamogordo, New Mexico, a state away? It was the obvious question, but the investigators of the day measured the remains and estimated that the child was around 7 years old, older than 4-year-old Sharon, and the clothing did not seem to match what Sharon had been wearing. And so, on the strength of an age estimate that would later prove wrong and a detail of clothing, the connection was set aside. The two cases, the missing girl and the found girl, drifted apart, and each one went cold on its own, in its own state, for the next 6 decades. Have you ever wondered how often that has happened? How many times the answer was sitting right there, a state line and an incorrect estimate away from the question, and no one had the tools to close the gap? In 1960, an age estimate from skeletal remains was an educated guess, and a wrong guess could bury the truth for 60 years, which is exactly what it did. The people of that small Arizona community did something quietly beautiful in the face of a horror they could not solve. They did not let her be nothing. They raised money among themselves to give this unknown murdered child a proper burial, and they laid her to rest in a cemetery in Prescott, Arizona, and they put a headstone over her. But they did not know her name, and so they had to write something on that stone, and what they chose has become, in a way, the whole ache of the case carved into granite. Little Miss Nobody, a town's tenderness and a town's helplessness in 3 words. She was Little Miss Nobody, a child so completely lost that not even her name had survived, and strangers loved her anyway and kept her grave and did not forget her. For decades she lay there under that name, and every so often, as the science of the world crept forward, someone would try again. In 2015, more than half a century after she was found, investigators thought it was worth exhuming her remains to see what modern methods could do. A forensic artist produced a facial reconstruction, a sketch of the little girl she might have been. But the DNA science of 2015, as advanced as it seemed at the time, was still not equal to the task. The sample was too old, too degraded, and so they laid her back down, still Little Miss Nobody, still waiting for a science that had not yet arrived. And then came the same quiet revolution that had reached all the way to a river in Alaska. Late in 2021, a forensic genealogy laboratory in Texas, a company called Othram, that specializes in pulling usable genetic profiles out of the most degraded and ancient material, reached out and offered to help. This was work that cost money, and the money was not lying around in a decades-old cold case budget. So it was raised the way so much of this work is now raised, through the small generosity of strangers. A few $1,000s, crowd-funded, to give a nameless child a name. Othram took the genetic material that 2015 could not read and read it. And then they did the genealogy, tracing the branches outward from the little girl in the Prescott grave, following the DNA through family trees until it converged unmistakably on one family. It took them, by some accounts, only about 3 weeks. The match came back to a man named Roberto Juan Gallegos, Sharon's half-brother. The little girl buried under the words Little Miss Nobody was Sharon Lee Gallegos of Alamogordo, New Mexico, taken from the alley behind her grandmother's house on a summer evening in 1960, 4 years old, gone for what was very nearly 62 years. It was, at the time, the oldest cold case the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had ever helped to solve. Think about what that identification meant and to whom. The people who had loved Sharon as a living child were mostly gone by 2022. The aunt who had run for help, the parents, the grandmother behind whose house she was taken. The grief of the 1960s had been inherited, passed down to nephews and nieces who had grown up in the shadow of a family story, a little girl who was stolen and never found, a wound the family had carried across generations without ever getting to close it. One of them, a nephew named Ray Chavez, spoke after the identification, and what he said was not about anger, and it was not about the person who took her, whom no one has ever been brought to justice for. What he said was about gratitude and about peace. He thanked the strangers of that Arizona town who had kept his aunt safe in death, who had buried her and tended her grave and never forgotten her across 60 years. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping my aunt safe and never forgetting her." And he thanked everyone whose work had, at last, allowed his family to be at peace. She was not Little Miss Nobody. She had never been Little Miss Nobody. She was Sharon, born on the 6th of September 1955, a happy child with red-painted fingernails, and now, at last, her grave could say so. The family made plans to give her a headstone with her real name and her real birthday on it. And in time, she was brought home, back to New Mexico, back to the state she was taken from, to rest at last in the ground of the place where she had once played in an alley in the long light of a desert evening. The desert had kept her for 62 years. And then, through the patience of people who refused to let a nameless child stay nameless, it gave her back. Now, from the oldest of tonight's stories, we move to one of the most important. Though at first it will not seem important at all. It will seem, at first, like just another sad and terrible thing that happened along a road. But this next case, a young woman found in a ditch in Ohio in the spring of 1981, is the one that started everything. It is the case that proved the whole idea could work. Before genetic genealogy reached Sharon in the desert or Gary along his river, it had to prove itself once, on a woman known for 37 years only by the jacket she was wearing. Her name was Marcia Lenore Sossaman King, though for 37 years, almost no one knew that. For 37 years, she was the buckskin girl. Marcia was born on the 9th of June, 1959, in Arkansas. She grew up there, in and around Little Rock, and by 1980, she was a young woman of about 20, a person who did not stay in one place. She traveled. She was known to hitchhike, to catch rides and see where they took her, and in an era before cell phones, before the constant tether of the internet, a young person who traveled that way could go quiet for stretches at a time without anyone assuming the worst. She left her Arkansas home in 1980. Relatives saw her last in Little Rock, and then she was out on the roads of the country, moving, and the people who loved her waited, the way you wait for a wanderer, expecting a call, a postcard, a knock on the door. To be fair to the times, there was nothing alarming, at first, about not hearing from Marcia. That was simply how she lived. But the calls did not come, and the months stretched, and somewhere in that stretching, the ordinary silence of a traveler became something heavier and colder, though her family could not have known it yet, because in the early morning hours of a spring day in April of 1981, more than 500 miles to the northeast of Little Rock, a body was found in a ditch. It lay along a rural road called Greenlee Road, just west of the small city of Troy, in Miami County, Ohio, in the flat farm country north of Dayton. She was a young woman, fully clothed, and she had died only hours before she was found. The people who came to that ditch had no idea who she was. She carried no identification. She had no shoes and no socks, but she was wearing something that no one who saw it would forget, and that would give her the only name she would have for nearly 4 decades. A fringed buckskin jacket decorated with a Native American design, and so she became the Buckskin Girl. I will tell you how she died, once, plainly, and then we will move on, because Marcia deserves to be more than the manner of her death. She had been strangled, and she had been struck. That is all we need to say. The rest of what happened to her on that road belongs to her and to the people who loved her, not to us. You are standing in that Ohio farm country in the spring of 1981. The fields are just starting to come back, black earth turning green at the edges. A rural road, 2 lanes, a ditch running alongside it, the kind of road you drive down without ever really looking. This is where she was found, this ordinary agricultural nowhere, hundreds of miles from the Arkansas home she had left. How she came to be here, who she was traveling with, what ride she had caught and where she thought it was taking her. No one has ever been able to say for certain. She arrived in that ditch as a stranger, and for 37 years she stayed one. The investigators of Miami County did not give up on her, and it is worth saying that clearly, because it would be easy to assume a nameless woman in a ditch would simply be filed and forgotten. She was not. Her fingerprints were taken and entered into the national system in the hope that they would match a record somewhere. They did not. The case stayed open, assigned to detectives, worked and reworked across the years. In the early 2000s, as DNA technology advanced, the regional crime lab developed a genetic profile from her remains and entered it into the databases of the day, the systems that compare an unknown profile against known missing persons. And still, nothing. Because for a DNA profile to find a match in those older systems, the missing person you are looking for has to already be in the system too, and no one had ever filed a missing person report for Marcia King. That is one of the quiet cruelties of this case, and of so many like it. Marcia was an adult when she lost touch with her family. She traveled. She had gone quiet before. There was no report, because in the eyes of the system, There was no crime in a grown woman choosing not to call home. Her family knew better. Her family never stopped believing that something was wrong, and they never stopped hoping they were wrong to believe it. And here is the detail from this case that I have not been able to stop thinking about, the one that turns the whole 37 years into something almost too heavy to hold. Marsha's mother, back in Arkansas, kept the same house. For 37 years, she stayed in the same home and kept the same telephone number. She never changed it, because if she changed it, then Marsha would not be able to reach her. If her daughter was out there somewhere, if one day she finally decided to call, the number had to be the one she remembered. So for 37 years, an aging mother kept a phone line open to a daughter who, unknown to her, had died in an Ohio ditch in the spring of 1981, only months after she left. Picture that phone. Picture it not ringing year after year after year, and a mother who would not give up the number anyway, just in case. That is the shape of the not knowing. That is what these families live inside. And it is why the thing that finally happened matters so much, and why this particular case, more than any other we will talk about tonight, deserves to be understood as a turning point. Because in 2017, a small non-profit was founded, an organization called the DNA Doe Project, built for exactly one purpose: to take the nameless dead, the John and Jane Does, whose cases had gone cold because traditional methods had failed, and to give them back their names using genetic genealogy. It was a new idea then, unproven, the kind of thing that might work in theory. They needed a first case to show that it could work in practice, and one of the very first cases they took on was the buckskin girl. The material they had to work with was not good. There was a blood sample that had been sitting in storage since 1981, poorly preserved, degraded by more than 3.5 decades, but new techniques could squeeze a genetic profile out of even that. They built the profile and they uploaded it to a public genealogy database called GED Match, the same kind of database where ordinary people compare their DNA to find cousins and build family trees. And then the volunteers began to search. It did not take long. By some accounts, within only about 4 hours of searching, they found it. A match to a first cousin, once removed. From that single match, they began to build outward, constructing the family tree, and as the branches filled in, a name appeared on one of them, a family member who was missing and presumed by her relatives to be dead. Marsha King. They compared the profile against an immediate family member, and it confirmed everything. The buckskin girl, the young woman in the fringed jacket who had lain nameless in the Ohio ground for 37 years, was Marsha Lenore Sossaman King of Arkansas, 21 years old when she died. It was the first identification the DNA Doe Project ever made. The first time in the United States that this particular method, taking a nameless victim and finding them through the family trees of strangers, had solved a case like this. Every identification we have talked about tonight, and every one still to come, stands on what happened in those 4 hours in 2018. Sharon in the desert, Gary along his river, all of them, in a sense, were reachable because Marsha King proved first that the reaching was possible. When the sheriff's office contacted Marsha's family, they asked to grieve in private, which is their right, and which we should honor. But some of what was said tells you everything about the weight of that phone call, coming after 37 years. Marsha's mother, the investigators said, had lived in the same home all that time, had kept the same phone number all that time, holding on to the hope that her daughter would come home. They had been hopeful, one official said, that Marcia would come home, and now they knew that she would not. There it is again, the same terrible exchange we saw in Alaska. The answer arrives, and the answer is the end of hope, and it is still, somehow, better than not knowing, because now there was a grave that could bear her name. The headstone in Troy that had read only Jane Doe could finally be corrected to say who she truly was. The person who killed Marcia King has never been identified and never charged. Her case, in that sense, is still open. But she's no longer nobody, no longer the buckskin girl, no longer a woman known only by her jacket. She is Marcia. And the science that gave her name back went on from her case to give back hundreds of others, which brings us to a cornfield in western New York and to a 16-year-old girl who was found there in the autumn of 1979, and to two women, a half-sister and a friend, who between them refused to let her stay a mystery, because sometimes the answer does not come from a laboratory alone. Sometimes it comes because somebody who loved the missing person simply would not stop looking. Her name was Tammy Jo Alexander, and she was 16 years old, and for 35 years she was the girl in the red jacket found in a cornfield that nobody could name. Tammy was born on the 2nd of November, 1963, in Atlanta, Georgia. Her parents were Barbara and Joe Alexander, and like a lot of families, theirs came apart, and Tammy and her mother ended up in Brooksville, Florida, a small city north of Tampa in Hernando County. She had a half-sister on her mother's side named Pamela, and the two girls were close in the way that children get close when the adult world around them is unstable, when they become each other's safe place because there is not another one available, and their world was unstable. Their mother, by the family's own accounts, struggled with an addiction to medication she had been prescribed, and it made her volatile, and at times it made her a hard person to live near. The two sisters held on to each other in the middle of that. Eventually, Pamela got out. When she was around 11, she went to live with her paternal grandmother, leaving that difficult house behind, and she assumed, in the way children assume things about each other, that Tammy would find her own way out too, that her little sister would escape into some better life the same way she had. Tammy stayed behind longer with her mother and stepfather, and Tammy began to run. She ran away often, the way a kid runs from a home that has stopped feeling safe. She hitchhiked, sometimes with a friend named Laurel, the two of them catching rides from truckers, going wherever the road went. Once a trucker carried them all the way to California, and Laurel called home, and Laurel's parents paid for 2 plane tickets to bring the girls back to Florida. It was that kind of running, restless and searching and dangerous in ways a 16-year-old cannot fully see. And sometime in the first part of 1979, Tammy Jo Alexander ran one more time, out of Brooksville, out onto the roads, and this time she did not come back. You have to understand how that disappearance looked from the inside of that family, because it explains the 35 years that followed. A girl who ran constantly, who had vanished for weeks before and turned up in California, who came from a home so hard that leaving it made a kind of sense. When she stopped calling, no alarm went off. Her mother seems to have believed she had simply gone, the way she always threatened to, and started over somewhere far away. Her half-sister Pamela believed the same thing, and honestly, it was a hopeful belief. It meant Tammy was out there living a life, free of that house, maybe happier. Years later, their mother, Barbara, would die still believing it. She passed away in 1998 at 56, and her obituary listed her daughter, Tammy, as already deceased, because in her heart she had come to believe the worst. But she never knew. She died without ever learning what had truly happened to her daughter, because Tammy had not started over. On the 10th of November 1979, more than 1,000 miles north of Brooksville, a farmer in the little town of Caledonia in western New York was out at the edge of his cornfield off Route 20, near the Genesee River, southwest of Rochester. He caught a glimpse of something red among the stalks. His first thought was that a hunter had trespassed onto his land, that the red was a hunter's jacket. He walked toward it, and when he got close, he understood that it was not a trespassing hunter at all. It was the body of a teenage girl wearing a bright red jacket, lying in his field. She had been shot. I will say it briefly and with as much gentleness as the fact allows. She had been shot at the edge of the field near the road, and then moved into the corn and shot again. It was over quickly, and the investigators believed she had not seen it coming, had not turned or flinched, which is the only small mercy in any of it. Her pockets had been turned inside out, emptied of anything that could identify her. She had no wallet, no papers, no name. And that same night, a heavy rain fell across the fields, and the rain washed away much of whatever the person who did this might have left behind. So the police of Livingston County were left with a murdered girl in a bright red jacket and almost nothing else. They called her Caledonia Jane Doe. Some shortened it to Calido, and they set about the long, grinding, decades-long work of trying to find out who she was. They did not have nothing. She had been wearing a few small, distinctive things, the kind of things a teenage girl chooses for herself. A silver necklace set with 3 small turquoise stones, one of them shaped a little like a bird, and a 2-piece locket keychain, a heart with a slot cut into it and a small key that fit the slot, and on it an inscription, the sort of sweet and hopeful thing a young girl carries. He who holds the key can open my heart. Sit with that for a moment. A 16-year-old runaway carrying a keepsake about someone one day holding the key to her heart, murdered in a cornfield 1,000 miles from home, and buried under a stone that could only say, Jane Doe. For years those objects were shown around, published, circulated in the hope that someone, somewhere, would recognize the girl who had worn them. No one did. Meanwhile, back in Florida, life went on around the empty space where Tammy had been, and no one filled in the truth, because no one knew there was a truth to fill in. And this is where the story turns, and where it becomes, for me, one of the most quietly moving cases of the whole night, because the break, when it finally came, did not come from a laboratory reaching out. It came from love and from stubbornness and from a friend who simply would not let go. In 2010, Tammy's old friend Laurel, the girl she had once hitchhiked to California with, went looking for her. Decades had passed, and they were adults now, or would have been, and Laurel wanted to reconnect. She tried to find Tammy on social media, the way you look up an old friend, and she came up empty. There was no trace of her. So Laurel reached out to Tammy's half-sister Pamela, and the two of them compared what they knew, and a cold feeling settled over both of them, because between them they realized no one had actually seen or heard from Tammy Jo Alexander since 1979, not once, not in over 30 years. The comfortable story that Tammy had run off to start a better life began to look less like a comfort and more like a hole they had all been quietly staring into for decades. They tried to do the right thing, and here the system failed them one more time. Pamela believed her mother had reported Tammy missing back in the day, but when the family checked in 2014, the Hernando County Sheriff's Office told them there was no missing person report. There never had been. A 16-year-old girl had vanished in 1979, and because she was a known runaway, no one had ever formally recorded her as missing. She had fallen straight through the cracks and stayed there for 35 years. So Pamela and Laurel filed the report that should have been filed in 1979. They got Tammy entered into the national databases, finally, officially, a missing person at last. And that single act, filing the report that love and persistence had finally forced into being, is what closed the distance. Because now there was a record to match against. Investigators compared the DNA of the girl from the Caledonia cornfield against a sample from her half-sister, Pamela, and it matched. On the 26th of January 2015, more than 35 years after a farmer found a girl in a red jacket in his corn, the Livingston County Sheriff stood up and announced that Caledonia Jane Doe had a name. She was Tammy Jo Alexander of Brooksville, Florida. The girl in the field was the girl who ran, and her family, who had spent decades believing she had chosen to disappear, learned instead that she had been taken and had been lying under a stranger's kindness in a New York cemetery the whole time. Pamela had spent her life assuming her little sister had escaped to something better, the way Pamela herself had escaped. Learning the truth was devastating, of course it was, but it was also, at last, the truth. Tammy was no longer a runaway who had chosen to vanish. She was a murdered child who had been found and grieved and buried by people who did not know her name but tended her grave anyway. And now her family knew where she was. They could go to her. They could stand at a stone that said Tammy Jo Alexander instead of Jane Doe. The keychain had said that whoever held the key could open her heart. It turned out the key was a half-sister who never stopped wondering, and a friend who went looking after 30 years, and together they opened the door that everyone else had left shut. Her killer has never been found. The case is still open, and the sheriff's office out there still works it, still hopes that someone recognizes a detail and comes forward. But Tammy has her name, and she got it because two women who loved her refused to accept the comfortable lie and did the hard and simple thing of asking the question out loud, where is she? Where has she been all this time? Have you ever wondered how many of the missing are lost, not in the wilderness, but in the paperwork, falling through a gap between a runaway and a victim, never even entered as gone? Tammy was one of those. The wild place, the cornfield, kept her body, but it was the system that kept her a stranger, and it was love that finally made her a name. From that cornfield in New York, we go now to a stretch of interstate in Texas, and to another young runaway, even younger than Tammy, a girl of just 14, who left home in the north and was found, murdered, along a highway more than 1,000 miles to the south. She would be a Jane Doe for 41 years, and the way she was finally named, out of almost nothing, out of tissue so damaged that for decades it seemed useless, is a story about how far the science has come since Marcia King's 4 hours on a database. Her name was Sherry Ann Jarvis. She was 14 years old, and she had come a very long way from home. Sherry was from Stillwater, Minnesota, a town on the St. Croix River in the eastern part of the state. She was, by the pieces of her story that have been recovered, a child the systems of her time did not know how to help. When she was around 13, she was removed from her home over habitual truancy, over missing school, and placed into the custody of a state agency. Think about that for a moment before we go any further. Whatever was happening in her young life, the answer the world reached for was to take her out of her home and hand her to an institution. And she did what a frightened, unhappy 14-year-old does when she is placed somewhere she does not want to be. She ran. She did leave word. Shortly after she left, she wrote a letter to her family, and in it, she told them she would come back. That is the detail I want you to hold on to through this next part, because it tells you who she was underneath the label of runaway. She was a kid who rode home. She was a kid who planned to return. She was not throwing her life away. She was a child in motion, scared and young, who fully intended to come back to the people she loved. She just never got the chance. The agency that had custody of her reported her missing, which should have created a record that could one day be matched. But in one of those bureaucratic tragedies that runs through so many of these cases, the agency's records were later purged, so that decades on, when detectives went looking for that original report, there was nothing left to find. She had been reported missing by an institution that then erased its own paper. And so a 14-year-old girl traveled more than 1,000 miles across the country, from Minnesota all the way to Texas, and arrived as a stranger no one was looking for in any way that the databases could see. She reached Huntsville, Texas on Halloween, the 31st of October, 1980. Huntsville is a prison town, home to a large complex of state correctional facilities, and it is threaded with highways and truck stops, the kind of place where people are always passing through. Witnesses would later remember seeing a young girl that night and the next at a gas station on the south side of town and at a place called the Hitchin Post truck stop. And she was asking a strange and specific question. She wanted directions to the Ellis Prison Farm, one of the state prison units outside of town. Why a 14-year-old girl from Minnesota was trying to reach a Texas prison farm, no one has ever been able to say for certain. Maybe she knew someone who was incarcerated there. Maybe she had been told she could find work nearby. Whatever the reason, it was where she was trying to go, and she never made it. You are at that truck stop on the edge of Huntsville, late on a Halloween night in 1980. The big rigs are idling in the lot, their running lights burning in the dark, the smell of diesel and coffee in the cool air. A girl comes up, small, 14, though she might tell you older, and she asks you how to get to the Ellis unit. She is 1,000 miles from Stillwater, Minnesota, and she does not look like she belongs here, in this hard place full of grown men passing through in the night. And you point her in a direction, or you do not, and she moves on into the dark, and that is the last ordinary moment of her life. Someone at that truck stop or on that road offered a 14-year-old child a ride. And in the early morning of the 1st of November, a truck driver traveling along Interstate 45, north of the truck stop, near a farm road called FM 1696, found her body on the side of the highway. She had been assaulted and she had been killed. And I am going to leave it there, because she was a child, and the details of what was done to her are not something to be recited for an audience. What matters is the smallness of what was left to identify her. She had almost nothing: a necklace with a rectangular pendant, a pair of red leather sandals and some clothing near her body, and a face that no one in Texas recognized because she belonged to a family 1,000 miles north who did not know she had ever come to Texas at all. They buried her in Oakwood Cemetery in Huntsville under a stone that told the only truth anyone knew. Unknown white female, died the 1st of November, 1980. She became the Walker County Jane Doe, and for 41 years, she was the oldest unsolved case that county carried. A 14-year-old girl lying under a stone with no name, more than 1,000 miles from the town where her family still lived, still wondered, still did not know. The detectives of Walker County did not forget her either, and one in particular took her up as something close to a personal mission. His name was Tom Bean, and he was assigned the case in 2015, and like the investigators in Ohio and New York, he refused to let her be nobody. But refusing is not the same as solving, and for years the case sat exactly where it had always sat, because the tools did not yet exist to break it. The physical evidence that remained from 1980 had been preserved in a way that, ironically, made it harder to use. The tissue had been fixed in formalin, a preservative that keeps a sample from decaying but also chemically damages the DNA inside it. When investigators finally sent samples off for genetic testing in 2020, only a minuscule amount of usable DNA remained, so little that an ordinary laboratory could have done nothing with it. And this is where you can measure how far the science had traveled since Marsha King's 4 hours on a database only 2 years earlier. The Texas laboratory that took Sherry's case, a company called Othram, specializes in exactly this, in wringing a readable genetic profile out of material that everyone else has given up on. It took multiple rounds of testing, multiple attempts at genome sequencing, slowly building up enough genetic information, fragment by fragment, to assemble a profile from tissue that had been sitting chemically damaged for 4 decades. That in itself was a small miracle of patience and technology. And once they had the profile, the genealogy team did what by now had become the shape of hope in these cases. They compared it to the family trees in the public databases, and they traced the branches outward, and they handed the leads to Detective Bean. In March of 2021, armed with those leads, Bean did the human part of the work. He located about 6 relatives of the unknown girl, people who had no idea that the DNA of a Texas Jane Doe was about to reach into their family. Through conversations with them, he arrived at a possible name. He was pointed toward a close family member who agreed to give a DNA sample, and that sample confirmed it. The Walker County Jane Doe, the child under the nameless stone in Huntsville, was Sherry Ann Jarvis of Stillwater, Minnesota, 14 years old, missing since 1980. On the 9th of November 2021, the Walker County Sheriff, a man named Clint McRae, stood with the investigators from all the agencies who had worked the case and announced that she had a name at last. "We lost Sherry," he said, "more than 41 years ago. Not the Walker County Jane Doe, Sherry, a person with a family in Minnesota who had spent 41 years not knowing what had become of the girl who wrote them a letter promising to come home. And on her birthday, they replaced the stone. The grave in Huntsville that had said unknown white female for 41 years finally bore the name Sherry Ann Jarvis. She was still 1,000 miles from Stillwater, but she was no longer nobody, and her family, at last, knew where she was, and knew that she had not simply chosen to vanish, that the child who promised to return had wanted to return, and had been prevented. Have you ever wondered how many of the missing are children exactly like Sherry? Kids who ran from something, who were failed by the very systems meant to protect them, whose disappearances were written off because they had run before. The word runaway did so much quiet damage in these cases. It let the world stop looking. It turned murdered children into kids who had simply chosen to go. It took 41 years and a technology that did not exist when she died to correct the record and say what was always true. Sherry Ann Jarvis did not run away from her life. Her life was taken from her on a Texas roadside at 14. We've talked now about people found alone, one at a time, along rivers and roadsides and in fields, but some of these cases involve more than one person, and the next one is the story of two, a young man and a young woman, found together on a dirt road in South Carolina in the summer of 1976, murdered side by side and unidentified together for 45 years. Two graves, two blank stones, and two families in two different states who each, without knowing about the other, had spent decades wondering where their child had gone. Their names were Pamela Mae Buckley and James Paul Freund. For 45 years they lay in South Carolina under two blank stones, a young woman and a young man that the world called only Jane and Jock Doe. But they had names, and they had families, and they had, most likely, each other. It begins at dawn on the 9th of August, 1976. A truck driver named Martin Durant was passing through the rural country of Sumter County, South Carolina, on a narrow road called Locklear Road, a small connector running between Interstate 95 and a state highway, out in the flat, humid, pine-lined country between the towns of Sumter and Florence. He pulled over around 6 in the morning to rest, and when he did, he saw them. Two bodies, a man and a woman, lying on that isolated dirt road. He drove to a nearby store and asked the owner to call the authorities. And that is how it started, the way so many of these stories start, with a stranger stopping at the edge of an empty road at first light and finding what the night had left behind. They had not been there long. When investigators arrived, the couple had been dead only a few hours, so recently that there was no decomposition, their faces still clear and recognizable. Both had been shot, with the same weapon, a heavy revolver, in what investigators understood immediately to be a deliberate and cold killing. I will not linger on it. What matters is that neither of them carried any identification, and no money was found, and so two people who'd been alive that same night became, in an instant, a pair of mysteries lying in the Carolina dirt. But they were not without detail, and the details are so human that they ache. The young man was dressed in a red Coors t-shirt and blue stone-washed Levi's jeans. He had an appendectomy scar. He wore an expensive watch, a Bulova Acatron, and a ring inscribed with 3 letters, J.P.F. He had also had extensive dental work done in his life, bridges and crowns. The kind of detailed dental record that investigators were certain, absolutely certain, would identify him. The young woman had medium-length brown hair and bluish eyes, 2 small moles on the left side of her face, and she wore 2 rings in a Mexican style. These are the fragments of 2 real lives. A favorite t-shirt, a monogrammed ring, rings a woman had chosen because she liked them. You are on that road at dawn. The light is grey and getting gold, the pines standing black against it, the air already thick and warm the way an August morning in South Carolina is warm before the sun is even up. A truck sits idling on the shoulder. and two young people who, only hours ago, were alive, who had a whole geography of family and history and favorite things behind them, lie on the dirt of a road they were only passing through. Nobody here knows their names, and it will stay that way for 45 years. The investigators of 1976 did everything the science of 1976 allowed, and it is important to say that they tried hard for a long time. They circulated the descriptions across the country. They published the dental information. Sketches of the two faces were distributed nationwide. Their fingerprints were taken and sent out. The Sumter County coroner, a woman named Verna Moore, carried these two unknown people with her for decades, working the case right up until she retired in 2009. That man's extensive dental work, everyone assumed, would surely be recognized by some dentist somewhere. It never was. Every avenue that the era offered was walked all the way to its end, and every one of them stopped at a wall. There was one clue the investigators uncovered along the way, and it deepened the mystery in a tender direction. In 2007, the bodies were exhumed for DNA testing, and that testing established that the man and the woman were not biologically related to each other, which raised a quiet and human possibility. If they were not family, then who were they to each other? These two young people found murdered side by side on a lonely road far from anywhere. The theory that emerged was the one your heart probably already reached. They were a couple. Two people traveling together in a relationship, killed together, which meant that somewhere out there were two separate families in two separate places, each missing one of them, neither knowing that their lost child was lying beside a stranger's lost child in the South Carolina ground. The break came, as it so often does now, because a private citizen would not let the case rest. A man named Matthew McDaniel had followed the Sumter County Doos for years, and in 2019, he put the sheriff's office in touch with an organization whose name you now know well, the DNA Doe Project, the same group that had given Marcia King back her name. They began working the case in the middle of 2019. The genetic material had to be extracted from bone marrow, delicate and difficult work, and the funding, once again, came from the small donations of strangers who care about this cause. A couple of $1,000s raised to buy two people their identities back. By the autumn of 2020, a usable profile had been developed, and the genealogists began to climb the family trees. And in January of 2021, 45 years after a truck driver found them at dawn, the Sumter County Sheriff's Office announced who they were. The young man was James Paul Freund. He had been born in 1946 up in Massachusetts and had grown up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he graduated from high school in 1964. That same year, he enlisted in the Army, and he served, with postings that took him from Kentucky to a proving ground in Maryland and across the ocean to Germany. He was the only child of his parents, Adam and Loletta. And here is a fact that lands hard. No one had ever filed a missing person report for James Freund. He had left Lancaster in late December of 1975, and though he was gone, though he simply stopped being heard from, there was no official record anywhere that said this man was missing. His whole disappearance existed only as a private ache in the people who knew him, never entered into any system, never searchable for 45 years. The young woman was Pamela May Buckley. She had been born in December of 1951 in Redwood County, Minnesota, the first of what would be 5 children born to Robert and Shirley Buckley. She grew up in Redwood Falls, and she went to the high school there, and the small surviving details of her paint a picture of a particular kind of girl. She was in the drama club and the choir, and she loved to sing. Picture that, a Minnesota girl who loved to sing, in the school choir, in the drama club, the oldest of 5. She grew up and moved out to Colorado Springs, and she married. And in December of 1975, the same month James Freund left Pennsylvania, Pamela's family reported her missing. So her family had done the thing James's family had not been able to do. They had filed the report. They had made her officially, searchably missing. And still, for 45 years, it led nowhere, because the young woman they were looking for in Colorado was lying in a grave in South Carolina under the word Jane. 2 young people, both gone from their lives in December of 1975, from 2 different states, found together the following August on a South Carolina road. It seems almost certain they had met and traveled together and fallen into whatever they were to each other and died together, far from both of the homes they had come from. When the identifications came, the families finally understood what had become of them. Pamela's family in Minnesota, who had reported her missing all those years ago, learned at last where their singer had gone. And James was no longer Jock Doe, no longer a set of dental records that never got recognized. He was James Paul Freund, an Army veteran, an only son. No one has ever been charged with killing them. Over the decades, a few names were whispered in connection with the case, but nothing was ever proven, and no one was ever brought to court. And so, out of fairness, I will not attach the killing to anyone, because in this country a person is not guilty because a rumor pointed at them. The murder of Pamela and James remains unsolved, but they are not unnamed anymore. 2 blank stones in South Carolina can finally say who lies beneath them, and 2 families who spent 45 years staring into the same darkness from opposite ends of the country finally got to stop wondering. We have talked so far about people who vanished on the road, travelers and hitchhikers and wanderers, people whose disappearances were easy for the world to explain away as a choice. But some of the missing were not travelers at all. Some of them were among the most vulnerable people in any community, and they went unnamed for years precisely because so few people were watching out for them in the first place. Our next story is one of those, and it takes us to another cornfield in another quiet farm county, and to a young woman whose whole life had been marked by the failure of the people who were supposed to protect her. Her name was Peggy Lynn Johnson. Peggy was born in the spring of 1976 in Illinois, and she was born with cognitive disabilities that would shape every part of her short life. For a while, she had an anchor. She lived with her mother, and her mother cared for her, until Peggy was around 18 years old when her mother died. And with that death, the one stable thing in Peggy's world was gone. She had a disability that made it hard for her to navigate the world alone, and she had lost the one person who had navigated it for her, and so she drifted, as vulnerable people so often drift, into homelessness, into transience, moving through a world that was not built to catch someone like her. It was in that fragile, unprotected state that she was found by a woman who offered to take her in. On its surface, it looked like an act of kindness, a family opening its home to a young woman with nowhere to go. Peggy came to live with this woman and her husband and their 5 children in a home in McHenry, Illinois. But what looked like charity was something far darker, and I'm going to describe it with restraint, because Peggy suffered enough in life without being made a spectacle in death. She was not treated as a guest or as family. She was made to work unpaid as a housekeeper and a caretaker for the children. She was made to sleep in the crawl space of the home, and over the years she lived there, she was abused badly and repeatedly by the woman who had taken her in. This went on for something like 5 years, and at the end of it, Peggy Johnson was dead, and her body was carried across the state line into Wisconsin and left in a cornfield in the rural town of Raymond in Racine County in the summer of 1999. She was 23 years old. Here is the fact that should stop you cold. No one reported her missing, not one person. A young woman had been erased from the world entirely, and there was no report, no search, no flyer, because the person who had killed her was the same person who controlled her whole existence, and because Peggy had already been so cut off from everyone who might have loved her that her absence made no ripple at all. She had a sister she had never even met. There was no one positioned to notice she was gone, and so she became the Racine County Jane Doe, a murdered young woman in a cornfield with no name, and she stayed that way for 20 years. You are standing at the edge of that field in Racine County. It is farm country, flat and open, the corn tall in the summer, the kind of place that looks like the middle of America itself. Somewhere nearby, a road. This is where she was left. This ordinary and beautiful and indifferent landscape, a place people drive past every day without a glance. 20 years would go by, the corn would grow and be cut and grow again, 20 times over, above the memory of a woman no one was looking for. And I want to stay with that fact a moment longer, because it is the quiet horror at the center of Peggy's story, and it is a horror that reaches far beyond her. There is a whole category of missing people who are never searched for, not because no one could have loved them, but because the circumstances of their lives had already stripped away the people who would have raised the alarm. The ones with disabilities who have outlived their parents, the ones who have drifted into homelessness, who move through the world without an address, without a paper trail, without a soul keeping regular track of them. When one of them vanishes, there's no frantic mother calling the police, no flyer stapled to a telephone pole, no reporter asking where they went. They simply stop being anywhere, and the world does not notice the shape of their absence because the world had already stopped noticing them while they were alive. Peggy Johnson was one of those people. She had been made invisible long before she was killed, and the terrible efficiency of what was done to her depended entirely on that invisibility, on the near certainty that a young woman with a disability, cut off from everyone, would not be missed. There was one person, though, out in the world, who was connected to Peggy by blood, even if they had never shared a room. Peggy had a sister she had never met. Somewhere, all through those 20 years, that sister existed, living her own life, not knowing she had a sibling who had been taken in and worked and abused and killed and dropped in a field a few hours away. And when the identification finally came, it was that sister, among others, who at last learned the truth of what had happened to the family member she never got the chance to know. It is a strange and sorrowful kind of introduction to meet a sister for the first time as a name on a case file, to learn you had her and lost her in the same afternoon. But it is still something. it is still more than the nothing that had stood in that place for 20 years. The detectives of Racine County worked her case across those 2 decades and did not let go of her, running her information, entering her into databases as the technology allowed, exhuming her remains at one point for further testing. And in the end, the answer came from 2 directions at once, converging in the same year. On one side, genetic science had finally advanced to where her DNA could be compared against the family trees in the public databases, the same method we have watched work again and again tonight, and it began to point toward her family, toward the people she was connected to by blood, even though she had been so isolated in life. And on the other side, a person came forward with something they had been carrying. The woman who had taken Peggy in had, at times when she had been drinking, spoken of having killed someone years earlier, back when she lived in Illinois. A concerned citizen finally reported that to the authorities. The 2 threads, the genetic one and the human one, met in the autumn of 2019, a full 20 years after Peggy died, and the Racine County Jane Doe finally had her name back. She was Peggy Lynn Johnson. The woman who had taken her in, exploited her, and killed her was arrested, and in 2022, she was convicted of Peggy's murder and of hiding her body. I am not going to dwell on that person, because this is Peggy's story and not hers, and because giving the people who do these things too much of our attention is its own small injustice to the people they hurt. What matters is Peggy. What matters is that a young woman who was failed by nearly everyone in her life, who was disabled and vulnerable and alone, who was made to sleep in a crawl space and was never even reported missing, was finally seen. The sheriff of Racine County said something at the time that I keep coming back to. 20 years, he said, is a long time for an innocent victim to be nameless to the world. They gave Peggy a proper headstone, replacing the one that said only Jane Doe. And then they did something that I find almost unbearably tender. They took her home, and they buried her beside her mother, the one person who had ever truly cared for her, back in Illinois. And they did it on her birthday. After a life of being cast out and 20 years in a nameless grave, Peggy Lynn Johnson was laid to rest next to her mother on the anniversary of the day she was born. She had a sister she never met, and now that sister, at least, knew what had become of her and could grieve her by name. The cornfields in Wisconsin kept her for 20 years, the same way a cornfield in New York kept Tammy Jo Alexander. And like Tammy, Peggy was given back, not by a stranger's kindness alone, but by science and persistence and the refusal of a few people to let a nameless woman stay nameless. Our next person was not murdered. His story is a different kind of tragedy, an ordinary and terrible accident on a summer night, and it is a story about a young man whose family did not look for him for 20 years, not because they did not love him, but because they believed sincerely that he simply did not want to be found. It is also one of the first cases where the internet itself, thousands of strangers working together online, became the thing that finally brought a lost person home. His name was Jason Patrick Callahan, and for 20 years he was known only as the Grateful Doe. Jason was born in the spring of 1976, and he grew up in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Like a lot of young people in the early 1990s, he loved a band, and the band was the Grateful Dead. And loving the Grateful Dead in those years was not just a matter of music, it was a way of life. You followed the band from city to city. You hitchhiked and caught rides with other fans. You lived loose and light and on the move. In June of 1995, when he was 19 years old, Jason left home in Myrtle Beach to follow the Dead on tour, out into that traveling world of concerts and highways and strangers who were not quite strangers because you all loved the same thing. On the 26th of June, 1995, he was a passenger in a Volkswagen van, riding with a young man named Michael Hager, who was 21 and who was also a fan of the band. The two of them were on the road in Virginia, near a town called Emporia in Greensville County, when the van crashed. Both young men were killed. And here is where the two of them, who died in the same wreck, took very different paths afterward. Michael Hager was identified quickly, but no one could identify the passenger, who carried nothing that gave his name. Michael had told his father he was heading toward his mother's home in South Carolina, and he had never mentioned that he was traveling with anyone. So when the passenger died there beside him, there was no one to say who he was. He appeared to have been a hitchhiker, someone Michael had picked up along the way, a young man from nowhere. What he did have on him were the small artifacts of the life he was living. A tie-dyed Grateful Dead t-shirt, 2 ticket stubs from Grateful Dead concerts up in Washington, a cigarette lighter and 4 quarters, and a note written to him and found in his pocket, addressed to Jason and signed by 2 young women, both named Caroline. It was that note that gave him the only name anyone had for him. Because of the note and because of the t-shirt, investigators called him Jason, the Grateful Doe. And under that name, or under no name at all, he lay unclaimed and unidentified for 20 years. Sit for a moment with the small human tenderness of what he was carrying, because those few objects are almost unbearably eloquent about the life he was living. 2 ticket stubs, which means he had been to the shows, had stood in the crowd, had felt whatever it is that made all those young people follow that music across the country. A lighter and 4 quarters, the entire visible fortune of a boy on the road, enough for a phone call and a cigarette, and that note written to him and signed by 2 young women, both named Caroline. Somebody had written to him. Somebody had cared enough to put words on paper and hand them to him, and he had cared enough to keep the note in his pocket, to carry it with him down the highway, so that in the end, it was the only thing left in the world that knew his first name. He was not a nobody drifting through an empty life. He was a 19-year-old with friends, with a note in his pocket, with a whole warm human world around him that simply had no idea he had died. You are on a Virginia road in the summer of 1995. It is warm, the trees heavy and green, the kind of ordinary American highway that runs between one town and the next. A van has come to rest, wrecked, and inside it, 2 young men who had been traveling toward the same coast are gone. One of them will be home in a matter of days, gathered up and named and mourned by the people who knew him. The other will lie in a drawer, and then in a grave, under a name someone gave him from a t-shirt, while the summer he was chasing turns to autumn and then to 20 autumns, and the people who loved him go on believing all that time that he is out there somewhere, alive, simply choosing not to call. That is the particular cruelty this family lived inside. Jason was the kind of young man who had run before, who lived his own way, who had already put some distance between himself and home. When he stopped calling, his mother did not assume the worst. She assumed the opposite. She assumed he was out there, living the life he had chosen, following the music, estranged from his family the way young people sometimes become estranged, and that one day he might come back around. His half-sister said it plainly years later. No one ever thought to report him missing, she said, because they thought he wanted to be missing. So for 20 years, a mother believed her son was alive and simply gone, when in truth, he had died in a Virginia wreck within weeks of leaving home and had been lying in a nameless grave the entire time. And this is the case where the internet, of all things, became the bridge. In the years after 2000, people who care about the unidentified dead began to gather online, on message boards and forums, and eventually on Reddit and Facebook. Ordinary people who spent their free time trying to match the nameless to the missing. Someone made a page dedicated to the Grateful Doe. A police reconstruction of what he might have looked like was posted and shared again, until by some estimates, more than 500,000 people had seen his face. And somewhere out in that vast crowd of strangers, the recognition finally happened. People began saying they thought his name was Jason, that he was from Myrtle Beach. A man came across the images online, and his heart sank, because he thought he recognized the young man, and he went to his mother and showed her the pictures. And she knew. It was her son. Her name was Margaretta Evans, and in January of 2015, after 20 years of believing her son was alive somewhere, she filed the missing person report that would finally let the DNA be compared. His family gave their DNA, his mother and his half-sister among them. And in December of 2015, the comparison confirmed it. The Grateful Doe was Jason Patrick Callahan of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, 19 years old when he died. On the online page where thousands of strangers had worked for years to find him, someone posted the news, and the words they chose are the words that belong on every story tonight. Because of everyone here, they wrote, "This man will finally make his way home." His half-sister said she was relieved and heartbroken at once, that she had wanted so badly to reconnect with the brother she had not seen since they were children and now never could. There it is again, that double edge, the answer that heals and wounds in the same motion. But Jason was no longer the Grateful Doe. He was Jason, a young man who loved a band and rode the highways of a lost summer, and his family, at last, could bring him home. Our next person was, like so many tonight, a young woman who left home and whose family assumed she had simply chosen to stay away. She was found on a cold Halloween morning in Texas, wearing almost nothing, and for 40 years she was known only by the color of her socks. Her name was Deborah Louise Jackson. Deborah was born in the autumn of 1956 in Texas, and she grew up to be a young woman who, like Marcia King and Tammy Jo Alexander before her, did not stay put. She left her home in Abilene around 1977, and she traveled and worked where she could. A stretch in Amarillo, where she worked at a hotel, some time at an assisted living center in a town northwest of Fort Worth. She was making her own way, out on her own in the wide state of Texas, and her family, when they stopped hearing from her, drew the conclusion that so many families in these stories drew. She had left before. She had struck out on her own before. They believed she was simply out there living her life, doing okay. And so, once again, no missing person report was ever filed, and Deborah Jackson existed nowhere in the systems that might one day have found her. On the morning of Halloween, the 31st of October, 1979, A passerby along Interstate 35, just north of the town of Georgetown, north of Austin, saw something in a concrete drainage culvert beside the busy highway. It was the body of a young woman. She had been killed, strangled, and left there, and she had died only hours before she was found, which meant she had been alive, and somewhere nearby that very night, she wore almost nothing, a pair of orange socks, and a single ring set with a pearl-colored stone. That was all. And because there was so little else to hold on to, the orange socks became her name. For 40 years, she was Orange Socks, a young woman in a ditch beside a Texas interstate, buried under a stone that read simply, "Unidentified Woman." You are on the shoulder of that interstate on a cold Halloween morning in 1979. The traffic is already moving, headlights in the grey dawn, the temperature down near freezing, a light rain falling. Cars rush past a concrete culvert without slowing, the drivers on their way to work, to school, to ordinary days. And down in that culvert lies a young woman who, hours ago, was alive, and who now has been reduced by her killer to a pair of orange socks and a question. Thousands of people would drive that stretch of Interstate 35 in the years that followed, never knowing that a nameless daughter had once lain in the ditch beside them. There is a pattern by now, and you have surely noticed it, running like a dark thread through so many of these stories. Marcia King, Tammy Jo Alexander, Sherry Jarvis, Deborah Jackson. Young women who left home, who were known to leave home, who had struck out on their own before, and whose families therefore did not sound the alarm when the letters and the phone calls stopped. It is not that these families did not love them. It is that the world had taught them a story that felt reasonable, the story that a restless young woman who leaves is simply living her life somewhere else and will turn up again when she is ready. That story is a trap. It is the exact story that lets a young woman disappear completely, because it explains her silence away. It fills the terrible gap with a comforting fiction, and it keeps her out of the missing person databases where she might one day have been found. Deborah Jackson fell straight into that trap. She was making her own way in the world, working her jobs, moving from town to town. And when she went quiet, the people who loved her told themselves she was fine, she was out there, she was doing okay. And so, like so many others, she existed in no system at all, a murdered woman that no one had officially reported as even missing. The Williamson County investigators reopened her case when they formed a cold case unit, and they brought in the DNA Doe project, and the genealogists began building her profile against the family trees. But the break, when it came in 2019, came the way several of these breaks have come, from the meeting of the science and a human being who recognized a face. The investigators released an updated forensic sketch of what Orange Socks might have looked like, and a woman in Abilene, one of Deborah's sisters, who had recently moved to the very county where Deborah's body had been found, saw that sketch on the news, and she knew. She telephoned the investigators to tell them that the woman in that sketch was her own sister, Deborah. The DNA of Deborah's sister was compared against the profile the genealogists had built, and it confirmed the sibling match, and the small physical clues confirmed it too. The scars on Deborah's legs from a childhood infection, her uniquely shaped earlobes, her unusually long toes. After 40 years, Orange Socks was Deborah Louise Jackson of Abilene. The person who killed her has never truly been established. Years ago, a man confessed to her murder, and was even convicted of it. But he later took the confession back, and he was a man who confessed to a great many killings he could not possibly have committed. So grave doubts have always hung over whether he was really the one, which is to say, honestly, that the question of who killed Deborah Jackson remains open. But her name is no longer open. When the sheriff spoke to one of Deborah's family members after the identification, the family member said something simple and whole. They said, "We can let her rest now, not orange socks." Deborah, a daughter with a name, who could finally be allowed to rest. Our next two people are among the quietest of all tonight's stories, and one of them is unlike anyone else we have talked about, because she was not a young runaway or a traveler at all. She was an older woman, a mother and a grandmother, born before the First World War, and she was hidden so completely that for nearly 40 years she was less a person than a local legend. Her name was Louise Virginia Peterson Flesher, and she was born in the summer of 1915 in the hills of West Virginia, before the First World War had even reached America. She lived a long life before it ended. She moved west, out to Wyoming, where she went to high school and raised a family of her own, daughters who would grow up and have lives and children of their own. She was, by the time our story reaches her, an older woman, somewhere around 65, a mother and a grandmother, the kind of woman whose presence anchors a family. And then, sometime around the turn of the 1980s, she was murdered, and she was hidden so thoroughly that her own family would not learn what had become of her for nearly 4 decades. On a spring day in April of 1981, in a rural corner of Lawrence County, Ohio, in the Appalachian foothills near a place called Greasy Ridge, 2 teenage girls were out playing near an old abandoned cistern, one of those covered wells that dot old farm country built to hold water. They lifted the cover, and inside they found something they could not understand at first, something that turned out to be the remains of a woman. She had been strangled, and she had been deliberately hidden down in that well, weighted down and concealed so completely that she might never have been found at all. She had been in there, investigators believed, for as long as 2 years, and the concealment had done its work. Her body was too decomposed to recognize, and there was nothing to say who she was. She became the Chesapeake Jane Doe. But over the years, as the case went unsolved and the details spread through that rural community, she became something else, something that troubles me to think about. She became a legend, a local ghost story, the bell in the well, a spooky tale that people in that part of Ohio grew up hearing, an urban legend about a nameless woman found down a well, told the way children tell each other frightening stories. Think about that fate. A real woman, a mother and a grandmother born in 1915, murdered and hidden, and then slowly transformed by time and forgetting into a piece of folklore, her humanity worn away until she was just a spooky story with no name. For 38 years, that was what remained of Louise Flesher, a legend at the bottom of a well. You are in those Appalachian foothills on a spring afternoon in 1981. It is quiet, hill country, the trees just coming into leaf, an old farm property gone half to seed, the kind of place where the works of people are slowly being taken back by the land. There is an old cistern, a covered well, the sort of thing that sits forgotten on rural properties all over that part of the country, its stone lip worn, its cover heavy and dark. 2 teenage girls are out exploring the way kids do, poking around a place they probably were not supposed to be. They lift the cover, and the ordinary spring afternoon breaks in half because down inside that well is something that should not be there, something that their minds cannot arrange into sense at first and then can. There is a person down there. There has been a person down there, in the dark, for a very long time. I think often about what it means that Louise became a legend rather than a woman. It is a specific kind of second death, the one that time and forgetting perform on the nameless. First, she was murdered and hidden, which was the work of a person, but then, over the decades, she was slowly emptied of her humanity by the community itself, not out of cruelty, but out of distance, until the real woman, the one born in 1915, who had raised daughters and lived a long life, was worn down into a shivery story that teenagers told each other at night. The bell in the well, a ghost, a spook, a local legend. Almost no one telling that story stopped to think that the bell had been a person, that she had a maiden name and a birthday and children who were, at that very moment, somewhere out in the world, wondering what had become of their mother. That is what namelessness does over enough years. It turns a human being into a campfire tale. And the work of the people who finally identified her was, in a very real sense, the work of turning her back from a legend into a woman. What gave Louise back her humanity was, once again, the patient work of the DNA Doe Project, and it was some of the hardest work they had ever done. They took genetic material from her remains and began building the family tree. But her case was unusually difficult, because in the small, old community her family came from, distant cousins had married distant cousins for generations, tangling the branches together in ways that made the genealogy maddening to trace. For 14 months, volunteers worked those tangled trees, and the thing that finally broke it open is, like so much of this science, almost absurdly ordinary and human. One of Louise's parents had been a German immigrant, and somewhere out in the world, a person in Canada with German ancestry, curious about their own heritage, took a consumer DNA test and uploaded the results to a public database, never imagining that their curiosity would help name a woman murdered in Ohio before they were likely even born. That single upload gave the genealogists the thread they needed. They followed it, and it led them to Louise, and then to 2 of her daughters. One of those daughters gave a DNA sample, and in the summer of 2019, the comparison confirmed it. The bell in the well, the legend at the bottom of the cistern, was Louise Virginia Peterson Flesher, a mother and a grandmother, and her daughters, at long last, knew what had happened to her. No one has been charged with her murder, but she is not a ghost story anymore. She is a woman with a name and a family and a life that stretched from before the First World War to a spring in the early 1980s, and the people who descended from her finally know where she went. Our next story takes us out of the country entirely, across the northern border, and it is unlike almost any we have told tonight, because the woman at its center was not a runaway, or a drifter, or someone the world could easily misplace. She was a successful, admired businesswoman in the prime of her life. She vanished on a trip. She was found in a river in another country, and it would take almost 50 years and a scientific first to bring her home. Her name was Jewel Parchman Langford, though the people who loved her called her Lala. Jewel was, by every account, a remarkable woman, and she was remarkable at a moment in history when it was not easy for a woman to be. She lived in Jackson, Tennessee, where she co-owned a health spa with her former husband and became a genuine force in the business community. She served as the head of the local chapter of the American Business Women's Association. In the early 1970s, her colleagues voted her their Woman of the Year. This was in the years right after the Civil Rights Act, when the whole idea of a woman leading in business was still new and still resisted, and Jewel was out in front of it, a mentor and an inspiration to the people around her. One of the investigators who would later work her case described her simply. She truly was ahead of her time, the investigator said, a beloved daughter, a sister, a cousin, and a friend. In April of 1975, Jewel traveled north to Montreal in Canada, and she never came home. Her family in Tennessee, when she stopped answering, did the thing that so many families in tonight's stories were never able to do. They knew something was wrong, and they reported her missing. But she had crossed an international border into another country's jurisdiction, and whatever had happened to her had happened far from home, and the trail went cold almost immediately. What had happened was this. On the 3rd of May, 1975, only weeks after she arrived in Canada, the body of a woman was found in the Nation River in eastern Ontario, not far from a highway bridge near a town called Castleman, a stretch of country between Ottawa and Montreal. She had been killed, and her body had been put into the river from the bridge above. And though the Canadian investigators worked the case, they could not determine who she was. An American woman, murdered and placed in a Canadian river with nothing to say her name. She became the Nation River Lady, and for decades, she was one of Canada's most haunting, unsolved cases, a nameless woman in the water, while 3,000 miles away in Tennessee, a family waited and did not know. Think about the particular helplessness of that family. They had done everything right. They had reported her missing. They had raised the alarm. And still their sister and daughter had simply dissolved into another country's cold case files beyond their reach. For 47 years they lived without an answer. At one point, someone who loved Jewel placed a grave marker for her, a stone that did not bear her name because they did not yet have her back, a stone that read instead, missing, but not forgotten. That is what her family had for almost half a century, not a grave with her name, a stone that promised they had not stopped remembering a woman they could not find. There's something about that phrase, missing but not forgotten, carved into stone by a family that had nothing else to hold, that gets at the whole strange geography of these losses. When someone dies and you can bury them, grief has a place to live. There is a stone, a date, a spot of ground you can stand over. But when someone simply vanishes, the grief has nowhere to go. It cannot settle. It hovers, year after year, because a part of you cannot stop scanning the crowd, cannot stop half expecting the phone to ring, cannot fully commit to mourning someone who might, for all you truly know, be alive. The Langford family lived in that suspended place for 47 years. They could not have her back and they could not lay her down. So they did the only thing left to do. They carved their refusal to forget her into a stone and waited, without much hope, for a day they had no real reason to believe would ever come. And I want you to notice where this story took place because it echoes the very first story we told tonight. Gary Southerden was found as a skull a few miles from the Canadian border. in the empty country where Alaska bleeds into the north. Jewel Langford, an American woman, was found across that same border in an Ontario river. The wild and lonely places do not stop at the lines we draw on maps. The emptiness that swallows people runs right across the border in both directions. And so, now, does the science that brings them back. It was a cross-border effort, Canadian and American investigators working together, that finally carried Jewel home, the same way it had carried Gary home from the far edge of the map. The land is bigger than our borders, but so, it turns out, is the determination to bring the lost back from it. The Canadian investigators never let her go. Over the decades, they tried everything the science of each era offered, including, as late as 2017, building a three-dimensional facial approximation of what she might have looked like, hoping someone would recognize her. Nothing worked. And then, at the very end of the 2010s, they turned to the same tool we have watched work all night. In late 2019, a usable DNA profile was finally developed from her remains, and it was compared against the family trees in the genetic databases, and it matched two people who shared her blood. From those matches, the genealogists built the tree, and the tree led them home, to Tennessee, to Jewel Parchman Langford. It was, the authorities said, the first time in Canada that human remains had ever been identified this way. The chief coroner of Ontario put the meaning of it plainly. For 47 years, he said, Jewel Langford's family did not know where she was, or whether they would ever learn what happened to her. And now, at last, they did. In the spring of 2022, Jewel's remains were carried back across the border to the United States, home to Tennessee, and her family held a memorial service and finally buried her. And they took down that old stone, the one that said missing but not forgotten, and they replaced it with one that at last bore her name. She was not the Nation River lady anymore. She was Jewel, ahead of her time, beloved, found. A man who had known her was eventually charged in connection with her death, so that even this, one of the coldest cases in a whole country, moved towards some kind of answer. But the answer that mattered most to her family was the simplest one. After 47 years, they knew where she was, and they could bring her home. Our next young woman had almost the opposite life, a life of hardship from the very beginning, and yet her story ends in the same place, with a name restored and a community that refused to let her stay forgotten. Her name was Dana Lynn Dodd. Dana was born in Florida, and life was hard for her from the start, in the way it is hard for children who are not given much of a foundation to stand on. Her mother left when Dana was a baby. Her father struggled and spent time without a home of his own. Dana grew up without the safety net that most children take for granted, and by the time she was a young teenager, she had already left home, out on her own far too early, the way children do when home is not a place that holds them. She was reported missing at one point, back when she was still a girl, and she kept moving, kept drifting, through a young life that never got the chance to settle. By the autumn of 2006, Dana was 21 years old, and she was in East Texas. One day, she got into a stranger's car outside a store in the town of Longview, and that was the last that anyone who might have loved her would know of her for a very long time. On the 29th of October, 2006, two men who had gone out to a rural oil lease to shoot targets in a heavily wooded stretch of country north of the town of Kilgore, found the body of a young woman among the trees. She had been killed, and her body had been burned, and there was almost nothing left to say who she was. The investigators could tell she had been small and young, and that she still had a couple of her baby teeth. She was wearing a lavender sweater, and because of that sweater, for the next 12 years, she had a name that was not her name. Lavender Doe. You are in those East Texas woods. It is oil country, pine and scrub and red dirt, dotted with the slow-nodding pump jacks that work the ground. The kind of place where a person can go unseen for a long time. Two men come out to shoot on an ordinary autumn afternoon, and among the trees they find a young woman who should have had her whole life in front of her, reduced to a mystery, a nameless girl in the woods. She would stay that way for 12 years, while somewhere her family did not know, and while the pump jacks nodded on, indifferent, above the place where she was found. Think about how much had already been taken from Dana before that autumn afternoon in the woods. Some of the people we have met tonight had childhoods full of choir practice and drama club, homes they left restlessly, families with the resources to search. Dana had almost none of that. She was handed a hard start and never got a softer middle. A mother gone before she could remember her. A father who struggled to keep a roof over his own head. A girlhood spent already out on her own, already vulnerable, already moving through a world that offers very little protection to a young person with no one standing behind them. When a life like that ends in violence and then in anonymity, there is a temptation to let it pass as just one more sad statistic, the kind of story the world has trained itself to look away from. And that is exactly the temptation that the people who worked her case refused. They looked directly at the young woman in the woods, the one the world had never protected, and they decided she was worth years of unpaid labor to name. There is a phrase that one of the genealogists who does this work likes to use, and it fits Dana's story better than any other tonight. We do not bring closure, she said. We bring information. We bring an end to a story, so that all the energy a family has been spending to wonder about their loved one can finally be spent on grief instead. That is the honest shape of what this science offers. Not a happy ending, because there are no happy endings in these stories. Just an end to the wondering. Just the difference between a question that never stops and an answer, however hard, that a person can finally lay down. Her case was worked hard, and it took a strange and difficult path. In the summer of 2018, a man was arrested for the murder of a different woman in the same part of Texas, and during his confession, he admitted that years earlier he had also killed the young woman known as Lavender Doe. But here is the thing that shows you exactly why this science matters so much. The man who had killed her could not tell them who she was. He had taken her life, and he did not even know her name. Her killer's confession solved the question of who did it, and left the deeper question, the question of who she was, completely untouched. Only one thing could answer that, and by then, the volunteers of the DNA Doe project were already at work on her, building her family tree out of the genetic threads, tracing her ancestry back and then forward again until the branches led them to a cousin, and through that cousin to her name. In early 2019, Lavender Doe became Dana Lynn Dodd once more. Her brother spoke about the moment they got the call. When we got that first phone call that it could possibly be her, he said, It was breathtaking. She's not Jane Doe anymore. She's Dana Lynn Dodd. And then something happened that I find deeply moving. Her family came out from Florida to that East Texas town where she had died among strangers, and they held a service for her, and they made a decision. They decided to let Dana rest there, in Texas, in the community that had carried her for all those years, because the people there had come to feel that she was one of their own. Dana needed to be here, one family member said, because she is part of this town's family now. A girl who had spent her short life without a place that truly held her was, in the end, claimed by a whole town and given a name, and laid to rest among people who had refused to forget her. Our next story is about that same kind of grace, the grace of strangers, taken about as far as it can go, because the young woman we are about to meet was cared for and buried and remembered for 40 years by an entire town full of people who never knew her name and who loved her anyway. Her name, we finally learned, was Dawn Olenek, but for 4 decades the world knew her by the name that town gave her, Princess Doe. Dawn was born in the summer of 1964, and she grew up on Long Island in New York. Her parents divorced, and she lived with her mother and her sister. And like several of the young people we have met tonight, her home life frayed. In the early summer of 1982, when she was 17 years old, just finished with her junior year of high school, she left home, and she was never seen by her family again. She went out into the world the way a 17-year-old does. Sure, she could manage, and she disappeared into it. On a July morning in 1982, in the small town of Blairstown, in northwestern New Jersey, near the Pennsylvania line, a grave digger at the Cedar Ridge Cemetery noticed something in the dirt, a small crucifix on a chain, lying where it should not be. And when he looked closer, near the back edge of the cemetery, where the ground fell away toward a creek below, he found the body of a young woman. She had been beaten and killed, and left there among the graves. There was nothing to identify her. She was a teenage girl in a red and white skirt, with the nails of one hand painted red, and no one knew her name. And here is where this story becomes something rare. The people of Blairstown could have let her be just another cold case, a stranger passing through their county on the worst day of her life. Instead, they took her in. This small New Jersey town, full of people who had never met her, claimed her as their own. They gave her a name, Princess Doe, because they would not let her be only a case number. They gave her a funeral. They gave her a grave, and they tended it for 40 years. And on her headstone they had words carved that may be the truest expression of what this entire long night has been about. The stone reads, Princess Doe, missing from home, dead among strangers, remembered by all. Stop and let that gesture land, because in a night full of darkness, it is one of the purest lights we have. A whole town, full of people who had never laid eyes on this girl while she was alive, chose to treat her as their own daughter in death. They did not have to. She was, in the coldest terms, someone else's tragedy, a stranger who had died at the hands of another stranger and been left in their cemetery by chance. They could have processed her as a case and moved on. Instead, they named her something tender. They gave her a funeral the way you would for one of your own. They bought her a stone and they chose those words for it with obvious care. Words that acknowledged the whole terrible truth of her situation, that she was missing from some home somewhere, that she had died among people who did not know her, and then answered that truth with a promise. remembered by all. And then they kept the promise. For 40 years, the people of that town tended the grave of a girl whose name they did not know, brought flowers, held her memory, refused to let her become nothing. In every other story tonight, the strangers who mattered were the ones who came at the end, the scientists and genealogists. Here, the strangers were there the whole time, 40 years of them, keeping a nameless girl company until her name could be found. You are in that cemetery on a July morning in 1982. It is early, the grass still wet, the gravestones standing in their quiet rows. A gravedigger going about his ordinary work notices a small thing out of place, a crucifix and a thin chain lying in the dirt where no chain should be. He follows it, toward the back of the cemetery, toward the edge where the ground drops away to a creek, and there, among the graves of people who are loved and buried and mourned by name, he finds a girl who has none of that, a girl who has been beaten and discarded and left in the one place in the world that is entirely made of names, without a name of her own. The town would spend the next 40 years fixing that. They could not learn her name. So until someone could, they gave her theirs. For 40 years they remembered her. Her case became a landmark in its own right. She was, in fact, the very first unidentified person ever entered into the National Crime Database that American law enforcement uses to this day, entered back in the early 1980s, a small piece of history made by a nameless girl. Investigators across 4 decades refused to close her file. Her remains were exhumed for testing as the science evolved. And finally, in 2021, a tooth and a single eyelash were sent to a specialized laboratory, one of those places that can pull a genetic profile out of material so degraded that everyone else had given up on it. They succeeded. The genealogists built her family tree from that profile, and it led them to her brother, and through him, to her name. On the 15th of July, 2022, exactly 40 years to the day after that gravedigger found her, the world learned that Princess Doe was Dawn Olenek, a 17-year-old from Long Island. A man already imprisoned for other killings was charged in her death, so that she too, after 40 years, moved toward justice. Her family came to the announcement with her photograph pinned to their chests. A cousin, who had been a child of 13 when Dawn vanished, spoke for all of them. "We miss her dearly," he said, and he thanked the town of Blairstown, the strangers who had held her for 40 years, for treating his cousin as though she were one of their own, missing from home, dead among strangers, remembered by all. She was remembered by a whole town, until the day her real name could finally be carved beside the one they had given her in love. Our last stop before we come to the end takes us all the way across the country, to a sunny field in Southern California, and to a young woman from Maine whose family searched for her for 52 years, and who wrote her mother a letter shortly before she died, promising that she was coming home. Her name was Anita Louise Pitot. She was 26 years old, one of 7 children in a family from Augusta, Maine. And in the late 1960s, she did what a lot of young people did in those years. She went west. She traveled out to California with some friends, chasing whatever it is that California has always promised young people: sunshine and reinvention and a life of your own choosing. And she did not vanish silently. She rode home. In a letter to her mother postmarked in February of 1968, Anita said that she had found work as a waitress, that she was doing all right, and that she would be coming home in May. Home to Maine, home to her mother and her brothers and sisters. In May, she never came home. On the 14th of March, 1968, only weeks after she mailed that letter, 3 young boys were playing in a large open field in Huntington Beach, California, and they found the body of a young woman. She had been murdered, and though the police worked the case hard and preserved what evidence they could from that field, they could not determine who she was. She was buried as a Jane Doe in an unmarked grave in a Newport Beach cemetery, more than 3,000 miles from the family in Maine, who were, at that very moment, beginning to wait for a daughter who had said she was coming home in May. You are in that California field in the spring of 1968. It is bright, the light coming down warm and yellow the way it does out there, an open lot at the edge of a growing town, the kind of place where the suburbs have not quite finished swallowing the farmland. 3 boys are playing, doing whatever boys do in a vacant field on a spring afternoon, and then their game ends forever, because in the grass they find a young woman who came west chasing sunshine and a life of her own, and who will now never leave. 3,000 miles away, a mother in Maine is reading a letter that says her daughter will be home in May. Both of these things are true at the same moment. The bright field and the waiting mother, the ended life and the letter full of plans held apart by a whole continent and about to be held apart by 52 years. I keep returning to that letter because it is the second time tonight that a young woman promised the people who loved her that she was coming back. Sherry Jarvis wrote her family a letter saying she would return. Anita Pittot wrote her mother that she would be home in May. Neither of them was lying. Neither of them chose to break the promise. Both of them fully intended to walk back through the door, and both of them were taken before they could, and both of them left behind a family that had those words, that promise, to hold and to ache over for decades. Come home in May. It is such a small, ordinary thing to write to your mother. And it became, without anyone knowing it, the last gift Anita would ever give her family, a promise that turned out to be true in the only way that was left. She did come home. It just took 52 years, and it took strangers to carry her. And her family waited a very long time. Her parents waited and died still not knowing. Her brothers and sisters waited. A niece named Lori, who had been a child when Anita disappeared, took up the search as an adult. And for decades, she wrote letters and made calls to the Red Cross, to the Social Security Administration, to police departments in California, trying to find any trace of the aunt who had gone west and gone silent. The family feared within months of that last letter that something terrible had happened, but they could not prove it, and they did not have the money to travel across the country and search themselves. And so, like so many families tonight, they lived for decades inside the not knowing and inside the quiet, corrosive doubt that maybe Anita had simply shunned them, had chosen to disappear into a new California life and leave Maine behind. She had not. She had wanted to come home in May. In 2020, more than half a century after those boys found her in the field, investigators with the Huntington Beach Police Department and the Orange County District Attorney's Office turned to investigative genetic genealogy, the same science we have watched work all night. They built a family tree from her DNA, and they followed it home, and it led them to the Pittot family of Augusta, Maine. Orange County's oldest unidentified murder victim was Anita Louise Pittot, one of 7 children, who had written her mother that she was coming home in May of 1968. And because the investigators had so carefully preserved the evidence from that field back in 1968, including a single discarded cigarette, the same genetic detective work did something more. It identified the man whose DNA was on that evidence, a man who had never even been a suspect at the time, and who had died of cancer a few years before the case was solved. He was never going to face a courtroom, but the family would finally know what had happened and to whom. And then the investigators did the thing that I think is the truest measure of why this work matters. They did not simply mail the family a report. They personally carried Anita's remains across the entire country back to Maine, and they attended her memorial service, and they stood with the family as Anita was finally laid to rest in the state she had left more than 50 years before, the state she had promised to come back to. Her niece Laurie, who had searched for her since 1980, said there was nothing the family could ever do to repay what these strangers had given them. "I'm so glad," she said, "that she's here and that we found her. It is a big weight lifted off. 52 years, and Anita Pitot came home in the end. Not in May of 1968, the way she had promised, but home. There is one story left tonight, and in some ways, it is the hardest of them all, and in some ways, it holds the deepest lesson about what these identifications give back to the people left behind. It is the story of a young mother who walked to the store on Christmas Eve and never came home, whose family spent 30 years living with the quiet, unbearable question of whether she had left them on purpose. And it is the story of the terrible, necessary gift of finally learning that she never would have. Her name was Susan Hope Lund, and she was a 25-year-old mother, and she walked to the store on Christmas Eve and never came home. Susan was born on the 29th of November, 1967. By the winter of 1992, she was living in Clarksville, Tennessee, a city up near the Kentucky line, home to the large army post at Fort Campbell, where her husband was a soldier. She was a young mother in the fullest sense of the word. She had 3 small children, a son who was 6 years old, and 2 little daughters, one 4 and one just 2, and she was expecting another child. Picture her life in that December, a house full of very young children, the exhausting and tender chaos of a home at Christmas time, 3 little ones and a 4th on the way, a soldier husband, a holiday to get ready for, an ordinary young family in the middle of the most ordinary and precious kind of life there is. On Christmas Eve, the 24th of December, 1992, Susan left the house. By the account her family gave, she was walking to a nearby grocery store, the kind of small last-minute errand that a mother of 3 runs 100 times without a second thought, especially on the day before Christmas, when there is always one more thing to pick up. She walked out the door into the cold, and she did not come back. You know this walk. You have taken some version of it yourself 1,000 times. It is nothing. It is the shortest, most forgettable kind of trip there is. Out the door, down the street, to the store on the corner, back home with a bag. On Christmas Eve, the streets have that particular hush, lights in the windows, everyone inside, the year winding down toward its quietest night. Susan Lund walked out into that ordinary evening to do an ordinary thing, and the door of her home closed behind her, and the small machinery of her family kept turning inside, waiting for her to come back with the groceries. She never did. And the not coming back stretched into the night, and into Christmas Day, and into a search Her husband reported her missing. A multi-agency search followed over the coming months, people looking for a young mother who had simply evaporated on a holiday errand. But there was nothing to find, no sign of her. And eventually, as these things did in those years, the search wound down, and the case was closed, and Susan Lund became one more name in the vast and quiet ledger of the missing. Her children grew up, and the question of what had happened to their mother hung over all of them, unanswered, for the better part of 30 years. And here is the part that makes this case different from the others, the part I most want you to sit with, because it holds the whole meaning of everything we have talked about tonight. When a young mother vanishes on a walk to the store and is never found, the world does not only wonder if she is dead. The world also wonders quietly, cruelly, whether she left, whether she walked away from her husband and her 3 small children on Christmas Eve and simply started a new life somewhere else. That suspicion, spoken or unspoken, attaches itself to a missing mother in a way it does not attach to almost anyone else. And her own family, over 30 years, lived inside that uncertainty. One of her relatives would later put it in the plainest possible words. "I always assumed," they said, "that she was still alive." That is what 30 years without an answer does. It leaves the door open not only to hope, but to a quiet, corrosive doubt about the person you loved. Maybe she was still out there somewhere. Maybe she had chosen this. Maybe she had walked away from them. Now let me tell you what had actually happened, and I am going to tell it carefully because it is grim, and because Susan was a person and a mother and not a piece of shock content. About a month after Susan disappeared, on the 27th of January 1993, 2 young girls in southern Illinois came upon human remains along a wooded roadway inside a state park. The park was called Wayne Fitzgerald, near the little town of Ina in Jefferson County, Illinois, roughly 175 miles away from Clarksville, a drive of about 3 hours. Only part of Susan was ever recovered. The rest of her was never found. I am going to leave the specifics there, out of respect, and simply tell you that what those 2 girls found was enough to know that a woman had been killed, and not enough to know who she was. The investigators in Illinois had a set of remains and no name. They could tell she had long, reddish-brown hair. They could tell she had a small mole in one ear, and extensive dental work, and a particular kind of skeletal asymmetry, a condition sometimes called wry neck, that in life may have tilted the way she held her head. They built what picture they could of a woman who had been, they estimated, somewhere between 30 and 50 years old. But they could not name her. And so she became the Ina Jane Doe, named for the place where she was found. And she stayed the Ina Jane Doe for nearly 30 years in a grave in Illinois, while 175 miles away in Tennessee, 3 children grew up not knowing that their mother was lying there. The 2 halves of this story, the missing young mother in Clarksville and the nameless woman in the Illinois park, sat only a few hours' drive apart for 3 decades, unable to find each other. There was no bridge until, once again, one was built. In February of 2021, a forensic anthropologist named Dr. Amy Michael from the University of New Hampshire approached the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and offered to re-examine the Ina Jane Doe case using the newest available methods. What followed was a genuine collaboration, the kind these modern identifications almost always are. There was a fresh anthropological analysis of the remains, There was DNA extraction and sequencing by a specialized laboratory. And there was the genetic genealogy itself, done by a firm called Redgrave Research Forensic Services, led by a genealogist named Anthony Redgrave. In February of 2022, they uploaded Susan's genetic profile to the same kind of public database we've seen work again and again tonight. And the team of genealogists went to work. And it went fast. Within about a day of receiving the genetic matches, the team had found probable relatives on both sides of the woman's family. They narrowed and narrowed, working down the branches toward the immediate family, and they landed on a couple who had raised several children, one of whom was a woman named Susan Lund. And Susan Lund, they discovered, had no documented death date. There was no record of her dying and no proof of life, no activity of any kind after 1993. That absence was itself a clue, a person-shaped hole in the records. When they looked further, they found that Susan had been reported missing the month before the Ina Jane Doe was discovered. The month before, the pieces fell into place. They took their findings to the detectives, who followed up with Susan's family, and one of Susan's siblings provided a DNA sample for a direct one-to-one comparison. On the 6th of March, 2022, that comparison came back a match. And on the 11th, the sheriff's office announced it to the world. The Ina Jane Doe was Susan Hope Lund of Clarksville, Tennessee, missing since Christmas Eve of 1992. She had not left. Understand what that identification gave back to her children. For 30 years, some part of the world had held open the possibility that Susan Lund walked away from her family on Christmas Eve and never looked back. The identification closed that door forever. She did not abandon her son and her daughters. She did not choose a new life over theirs. She walked to the store on Christmas Eve, exactly as her family always said, and she was taken, and she was killed, and she was carried 175 miles from her children and left in the brush along a park road. And she had wanted, with everything in her, to come home. The DNA did not only give Susan her name back, it gave her back her truth as a mother. It told her children at last and for certain that she never left them. No one has been charged with her murder. Like almost every case tonight, the identification answered the question of who and left open the question of who did this. But her family knows now where she is. They can grieve a mother instead of wondering about a woman who might have walked away. And that, in the end, may be the most important thing that this science does. It does not only match a profile to a name, it restores the truth of a person, and it lets the people who loved them finally stop wondering about the wrong things. Think of all of them together for a moment. A hunter along an Arctic river, and a 4-year-old in the desert, and a young woman in a buckskin jacket, a runaway in a cornfield, a 14-year-old on a Texas roadside, a couple on a Carolina dirt road, a man beside a highway, a woman at the bottom of a well, a lady in a northern river, a girl a whole town refused to forget, and a mother who walked to the store on Christmas Eve. The wild and lonely places of this country kept them for years, for decades, for the better part of a lifetime. And one by one, their names were given back. Let me talk, before we finish, about how that giving back happened, and about what it means for all the others who are still waiting. Every one of the people we sat with tonight was found the same way, in the end, by the same quiet miracle. And it is worth understanding, because once you understand it, you start to see how many more homecomings are still possible. For most of human history, a set of unidentified remains was a locked door with no key. You could describe the person. You could reconstruct their face, take their fingerprints, record their dental work, and send it all out into the world. And if no one happened to recognize it, the door stayed shut forever. That is what happened to Marcia King for 37 years, to the Sumter County couple for 45, to Sharon Gallegos for 62. The information was out there. There was simply no way to connect it to the answer. What changed is something that grew up quietly in the background of ordinary life, made not by police but by all of us. Over the last 2 decades, millions of people spat into little tubes and mailed their DNA to companies to learn about their ancestry, and many of them uploaded their genetic profiles into shared databases so they could find cousins and fill in their family trees. None of them were thinking about murder victims when they did it. They were thinking about where their grandparents came from. But taken all together, those millions of family trees became a vast, interconnected map of how human beings are related to one another. And it turns out that if you have DNA from an unidentified person, even a tiny, damaged, decades-old sample, you can compare it against that map. You will not usually find the person themselves, but you will find their third cousin, their great aunt, a distant relative who tested out of curiosity. And, from that distant match, a skilled genealogist can climb the branches of the family tree, patiently, name by name, until they arrive at the one branch with a person-shaped hole in it, a relative who went missing, a relative with no death date and no proof of life. And there, at the end of the climb, is the name. That is what the DNA Doe Project did for Marcia King in 4 hours, and for the Sumter County couple. It is what a company called Othram did for Sharon Gallegos and for Sherry Jarvis, pulling readable profiles out of material that everyone else had given up on. It is what Redgrave Research did for Susan Lund. It is what the investigators in Alaska did for Gary Southerden. Different labs, different names, the same essential act of grace. They took a person the world had lost, and they followed a stranger's curiosity all the way home. Now here is the thing I most want to leave you with tonight, and it is a hopeful thing, which is not something you get to say very often in stories like these. All across this country, in medical examiners' offices and evidence rooms and quiet cemetery plots marked only Jane Doe or John Doe, there are tens of thousands of unidentified people. Each one is somebody. Each one belonged to a family somewhere that never got their answer, that is still, right now, tonight, staring at an empty chair the way the Southerdens did, the way Marcia's mother did with her unchanged phone number, the way Susan Lund's children did for 30 years. For most of the last century, those nameless people were simply filed and waited on because there was no way to give them back. And now, slowly, case by case, there is. The same quiet science that reached a skull along the Porcupine River is being turned on that backlog of the nameless. It is being turned on children in deserts and young women in fields and travelers on roadsides, one by one, as fast as the funding and the labor allow, which means that some of the still missing people who vanished decades ago, whose families have nearly given up, may yet be identified this way, years or even decades from now. It may happen because of someone who is alive tonight and has no idea they are part of it. A cousin who takes an ancestry test as a lark to see what their heritage is, and never learns that the little tube they mailed off held the missing piece of someone else's 40-year grief. That is how Gary was found. That is how all of them were found. by strangers who will never know what they gave. It is slow, and it is not certain, and I will not pretend that it can undo anything. It cannot bring a single one of these people back to life. It could not spare Susan Lund's children a childhood without their mother, or give Sharon Gallegos the 62 years that were stolen from her. But it can end the not knowing. And in these stories, the not knowing is its own kind of long, slow suffering, a question that a family has to wake up inside of every single morning for decades. So anything that finally answers it is worth naming as the mercy it is, because behind every one of these cases was a real person, and I want to say their names one more time before we go, not as case files, but as people. Gary Southerden, the free spirit from Clay, New York, who loved the biggest country he could find and rode the rails just to see the horizon. Sharon Lee Gallegos, 4 years old, happy-go-lucky, with her fingernails painted red. Marcia King, who traveled the country and whose mother kept the same phone number for 37 years, just in case. Tammy Jo Alexander, 16, who carried a little keepsake about someone holding the key to her heart. Sherry Ann Jarvis, 14, who wrote her family a letter promising she would come home. Pamela Buckley, who sang in her school choir in Minnesota. And James Freund, an only son and an Army veteran, found beside her. Peggy Johnson, who was failed by nearly everyone in her short life and was buried at last beside her mother on her birthday. Jason Callahan, who loved a band and rode the highways of one last summer, brought home by strangers who never even met him. Deborah Jackson, who could finally be allowed to rest. Louise Flesher, a grandmother who was turned into a ghost story and then given back her name. Jewel Langford, who was ahead of her time, and whose family traded a stone that said missing for one that said her name. Dana Dodd, who had so little in life and was claimed in the end by a whole town. Dawn Olenek, the girl a town called Princess and remembered for 40 years among strangers. Anita Bitteau, who promised to come home in May and came home to Maine at last, 52 years later. And Susan Lund, a young mother who walked to the store on Christmas Eve and who never, not for one moment, abandoned her children. They were lost in the wild and lonely places, the rivers and the deserts and the fields and the roadsides, the empty country that keeps its secrets, and one by one, the land gave them back, and science gave them their names, and the people who loved them finally got to stop wondering. So tonight, as you sit with all of this, maybe remember them not for how they were lost, but for the fact that they were found. Remember that somewhere out there, right now, a family is waiting for a phone call exactly like the ones in these stories, a call that will hurt and heal in the same breath. And remember that the thing that will finally bring that call is patience and science and the strange, quiet kindness of strangers who care about the nameless dead enough to keep working year after year to bring them home. 7 people went into the wilderness and did not come back, but they did not stay lost. And somewhere tonight, someone else, still nameless, still waiting under a blank stone, is closer to coming home than they have ever been.